Hello, my name is Professor Schock, and would like to welcome you to the first of my two-part lecture on Reconstruction. Today we'll be discussing emancipation, President Andrew Johnson, presidential Reconstruction, and the beginnings of radical Reconstruction. But before we really dive into what Reconstruction is, I would like to first pose a question. What is freedom? I think all Americans have probably a unique answer to this question, but for all of us, it probably involves either preventing someone from inhibiting the actions we can do or the abilities to do more actions that we want to. An example of this could be seen with, say, gun control. Some people believe that more control on guns means less chance of them losing their lives, which is a form of freedom. Others believe that inhibiting what they can and cannot purchase and use does inhibit their freedoms. Both are valid points of view. Whatever side you fall on is irrelevant. It's meant to show how, even amongst just our time, two different groups can have a different concept of the same freedom. And it's important to remember as we continue this conversation today that concepts of freedom change over the past several hundred years of this country. Freedom is not what it meant originally, and this is definitely a time in our history where that changes. Specifically, I want you to think now of what freedom was like before the Civil War. So the first thing that should come to mind should be black and white, or the white planter class and the enslaved black African American labor force. This should come to your mind immediately because this is kind of the hallmark of this time period. It's important to remember these aren't the only two groups, and that even within these groups there are still diverse viewpoints and groups within the groups. But obviously, if we're talking pre-Civil War, the antebellum period, African Americans' first and foremost concern in regard to freedom is not being enslaved. For the white planter class, the act of enslaving a labor force is a form of freedom for them. There's a lot of other business concerns that are related to freedom that also relate back to white masculinity. Women have a different concept of freedom at this time. It's a very, like I said, it's a very complex group, but for today, we're going to just stick with kind of the basics. And then, obviously, we're going to talk about how freedom changed after the war, which really will be what a lot of this lecture will be about. So what was life like for the newly freed African American population of the United States? I want you to picture you're an enslaved person working on a plantation. This is the only life you've known. Every day you've got up, you've known that you're owned by another human being. You know it's wrong, but you also know there's not really much you can do about it. I mean, not to say that African Americans didn't have their forms of rebellion that they engaged in on a very regular basis, but the harsh realities that you were an enslaved individual were never lost on you, at least in your adult life. But today's different, because it's 1865. The Union forces have defeated the Confederates, and emancipation is now the law of the land. You're free, you just don't know it yet. But a man, maybe one that you've known for years, maybe one you've never seen, walks onto the plantation you've spent your entire life on and tells everyone that it's over. He tells them that Lee has surrendered, that Lincoln has freed the slaves. You are no longer tied to this land, tied to this planter who says he owns you. It is an amazing day in your life. It is a day to celebrate. And that's what happened. They usually refer to them as jubilees, but they're parties. They're all over the place. Sure, there was plenty of dancing, drinking, probably lots of food too, probably much cavorting, a whole bunch of other stuff. Imagine a party. Now imagine waking up the next morning after that party. What do? Well, now that you're free to do things like search for families. Many African Americans were ripped apart from their families, potentially at a very young age. Frederick Douglass talks about how his mother was sold right before he was born, or right after he was born, and he almost never knew her. She had to travel most of a day just to see him. She was pretty much an unknown person to him because of this. Stories like this are not uncommon in the antebellum South. Antebellum meaning pre-war South. So now the war's over, you can now go find parents, siblings, wives, husbands, children, all these things. So African Americans commonly went looking for these lost family members and tried to reform their families. So obviously for some people, this was a huge freedom that had never before been allowed. Work is not only a freedom, but a question now. You used to have a job. Maybe it was a job you didn't like, but you had a job. Now you don't. You have to look for a job. Are there jobs? I mean, America's still really racist, even if you are lucky enough to have earned a skill. Like, once again, to reference Frederick Douglass, he was I believe he was a mason, worked with bricks. And he learned that skill while he was enslaved. And when he escaped to the north, he found that the field was too racist and he could not get a job working with any white bricklayers, and ended up having to abandon that career path. Obviously, if they don't have a skill, farming really is their only skill that they can do at that point. But they don't have a land to work. Many African Americans went straight back to working for the planter class that had previously enslaved them. This time for wages and not as in an enslaved workforce. But it's still, if I had spent my entire life enslaved, probably not the first plan on my list for a job. There's plenty of other questions. Are African American citizens? If I'm part of this newly freed population, I'm going to be looking at, am I an American? Can I stay here? What's going to happen to me? Should I stay here? Here as in either in the state or city I'm in, or in the entire United States as a whole. How is this different for women? Clearly women have different needs than men. So enslaved African American, or previously enslaved African Americans, so newly freed African American women, are going to have a different take. Probably involves childcare or maybe bodily autonomy. For many of those women, just being able to choose who they allow in or don't allow into their bedrooms can be the apex of what they consider freedom. So there's no one answer for this, but it's important to keep your mind thinking on what this would mean for all these different individuals. I have a quote at the bottom of the slide that says, from Frederick Douglass, says, "Slavery is not abolished until the black man has the ballot." That kind of leads into my idea of what Reconstruction is. And Reconstruction was very complex, but it was about assimilating the newly freed African American population into the social and economic / labor dynamics of a very, very new version of the United States. So what does this mean? How did the previously enslaved labor class become a free labor class? So on April 9th, 1865, the Civil War ends. On April 15th, 1865, President Lincoln is assassinated. That meant that Andrew Johnson became the 17th President of the United States of America. Even though he never ran for president, he never wanted the job as president, no one ever voted for him to be president, he was the man who got the job. He was the man who was left stitching America back together after the Civil War. He's generally not looked upon fondly as an American president. You'll see why in a little while. But I would also suggest that when you're thinking about him and his job, we have yet to have another Civil War. He did at least something right. But as I've kind of alluded to, he was meant to balance out Lincoln's ticket for a second term. So he was not like Lincoln at all. He was a Southerner, so he was meant to bring in some potentially Southern leaning or Southern votes. He was born in North Carolina, but at a very young age he moved to Tennessee, where he spent most of his life. He was a tailor. That was his family business. It was not a prestigious profession. He did not come from wealth. He did become a congressman for the state of Tennessee, and he later became a congressman in the United States Congress. He was very pro-slavery, and he was also very racist. Not just racist by our standards, but racist for that time. In fact, pretty much everyone in this time period, by our standards of modern day United States, we would consider racist. But we have to look at them in their time period. But for their time period, Johnson is generally considered very racist. But when the South seceded from the United States and created the Union, of all of the members of Congress from the South, Andrew Johnson was the only congressman to stay in his seat. Probably because of this, he was appointed in 1862 by Lincoln as a military governor of Tennessee. He did, over his time of service during the war, come to the realization that slavery was untenable for the United States, that it really was the wedge that was driving the North and the South apart, and to have one unified country, that slavery could not continue. This made him pro the 13th Amendment, which is the amendment that emancipates the slaves. But he was opposed to both the Civil Rights Bill and the 14th Amendment. The Civil Rights Bill and the 14th Amendment created a legal framework that made made African Americans equal in the eyes of the law. So you couldn't make laws like we'll talk about in a little bit that focus on only one group, like African Americans can't be out after dark, which some states did impose laws like that. Both the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Bill prevented that. The 14th Amendment is also the amendment that allows for birthright citizenship, which made African Americans citizens. We'll also talk about that a little bit more later. But he was opposed to both of those. He was also the first U.S. president to ever be impeached. Officially, he was impeached for shenanigans involving a cabinet appointment. He wanted to go around Congress and have someone appointed to his cabinet without their approval. But it was more than likely because he opposed Congress at pretty much every point he could. He was engaging in something we'll talk about very soon called presidential Reconstruction, which basically meant going around Congress to decide how the country should be put back together. When the vote came down to see if he would be removed from office after his impeachment, 7 Republicans dissented, which left him in office by a single vote. Might be important to note too here that Republicans are the majority of Congress. They are the party of Lincoln. They were created a little bit before Lincoln became president. They had the stance that slavery would not expand in the United States, not to get rid of slavery, but it would not expand. And they are now the party of the North, the party of anti-slavery in a sense, They are the ones that are controlling the government, largely because the southern states are not part of the United States at this point. They have to work to get back in after their secession. So, as far as presidential Reconstruction goes, that took place roughly between 1865, when the war ended, and 1867. It was basically a process where President Johnson decided that he knew what was best for putting the country back together, and he decided that he would make those decisions and go around Congress at every step he could. Him and Congress did not agree on much during this time period, so he would try and push legislation through, and he would veto anything that Congress passed or attempted to pass that he did not agree with. One of the, I guess you'd call it an interesting event that happened during presidential Reconstruction was President Johnson's issuance of pardons. So during the war, or after the war, I should say, everyone who was a member of the Confederacy, so like we're talking like generals and political leaders, so like if you were a governor of a southern state during the war, or if you were a member of the Confederate, like federal government, like a member of the Congress or something like that, you were branded as a traitor, and you were prevented from seeking any office in the United States government after the war. Seems to make sense to me. You had just engaged in a revolt against your country. You are now, that revolt is put down, and you're not quite welcome back into those same seats of power that you may have sat in before the war in the United States, and definitely during the war in the Confederacy. Johnson created a system where one of these individuals can simply write him, I assume, a very nicely worded letter requesting a pardon. I believe the letter had some sort of loyalty pledge within it, but there is no known version of these letters that President Johnson did not accept and issue a pardon for. There are a couple notable individuals who never asked for pardons. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, never asked, and Robert E. Lee, the lead general for the Confederate forces, never asked. It's thought that Jefferson Davis would almost certainly have not received one, but it's unclear on whether or not President Johnson would have given one to Lee or not. But everyone else who requested one, from our understanding, did receive one. There was also the fact of, the southern states had no governments. They were not part of the United States, and the Confederacy was gone. So who was going to run those states? President Johnson decided he was going to pick and choose who would lead those states. Oddly enough, in most of those situations, he went and took the person who was say governor of, let's say, Mississippi during the war, put them back in position of government, like governor of Mississippi, after the war. Maybe not that quite one-to-one, but these were Confederates, and they were very Confederate-minded, and they appointed other Confederates within the state. This meant these new governments were very racist and very anti-United States, or at least the United States of the North. So during presidential Reconstruction, President Johnson basically creates a system where we have North and South once again, even though slavery isn't a part of it, but it's still Northerners against Southerners, and he's trying to stitch this country back together in this way. Once again, this is one of the reasons why people don't like President Johnson, but something must have worked. So keeping with our theme of President Johnson and status quos in the Confederate South, in 1865, so once again right after the war ends, President Johnson returns confiscated lands back to Southern planters. So all those lands that the Union military ended up taking during war that belonged to Southern planters. These are people who run plantations, who own large amounts of slaves. This is a large part of the economic backbone of the South. He returns that land to the planters. This may seem normal to a lot of people, especially if you're not looking at what this means for the new African American labor class, but it's really detrimental. You now have a series of landed rich people that do not have any laborers for their land, but a huge amount of land, and you have a labor force with no land to work. As I mentioned before, a lot of these newly freed men and women ended up going back to work on the same plantations, especially once they found out that they weren't going to get land of their own. I mean, there's definitely instances right after the war and at the end of the war where African Americans think they're going to receive land. If you've ever heard of 20 acres and a mule, I think it is. There's other ideas like this, and there's instances where African Americans were given land after the war, or at least right at the end of the war, and then had that land taken back. This event forces the African Americans as to become an essential coerced labor class. This labor class, although not enslaved, they are treated poorly. In many ways, it's just rich Southern planters treating them the way they've always treated them. They're trying to return to a way of slavery, and this also leads to the act eventually of sharecropping. Sharecropping is a form of debt peonage, which is it's not totally uncommon from modern day credit card debt, but it ties the people to the land. And it's important to note that it's not just newly freed men and women who are engaging in this. It's also poor whites who now have the opportunity to engage in this. But when you become a sharecropper, you generally don't have any money to begin with. So you have to engage in debt. So you go to the landowner who has money and land, and you rent the land. That land becomes your property for purposes of living on, sustaining yourself, and making a profit. But to do that, you have to buy supplies. So if you're going to be a farmer, you have to buy seeds, you have to buy farming implements, you have to have a place to live, food to eat until your crops start coming in. You have to have other goods and whatnot for your family and yourself. You have to buy clothes. I mean, it's endless. All these things come at a debt to the planter who's renting you the land. And that's fine as long as your crop comes in and you're able to pay off your debts at the end of the season. If you have a bad harvest, or the planter who may used to own you decides they don't want to treat you fairly, and they've convinced you into an unhealthy loan that you can't pay back, you're now tied to that land. You legally can't leave because you're indebted to these people. Really just creating this air of coerced labor that is very similar in many ways to slavery. Still distinctly different, it's important to remember this, but similar, and it creates a economic situation that mirrors slavery in many ways. On the social side of things, we have concepts like the Black Codes. You'll see there are two examples on this slide. They're both from 1865. Most of them did not last long because things like the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act, which eventually were both passed, prevented making laws that specifically pulled out African Americans or anyone by race. So it made everyone equal amongst the laws. But these things did happen, and if you look at them and you read them, they're similar to things that went on under Jim Crow that happens after Reconstruction in the South and doesn't end, arguably, until the 1960s. There were some good about black codes. They did legalize African American marriage, which is important because before the black codes, before emancipation, African Americans were not allowed to legally get married, or at least enslaved African Americans were not allowed to legally get married. I honestly don't know about free blacks, but they were not allowed to get married under slavery, and they did have people that they recognized as husbands and wives, but there was no legal marriage. Black codes also created ideas of property ownership and gave African Americans limited access to courts, although there is plenty of evidence that, at least in some places, free blacks had access to certain court systems, like in, I believe, Baltimore, they had access to the court system. The bad, other than the racist, vile things that are shown in the examples on the bottom of the screen, they still could not testify against whites, which was not a thing before, or at least not supposed to be a thing, but it did happen at times. They could not serve on juries, they could not vote, and this is one of the important ones, they were forced to work. So an African American man or woman who was not engaging in work, maybe they're sitting even inside their own home, they could be arrested, taken down to the jail, processed, and then taken down to a plantation and forced to work on that plantation to work off their crime of not working. Definitely sounds like a reinstitution of social concepts of slavery that feed back into Southern ideas of enslaved workforces. Thankfully, like I said, black codes did not last long, but they are definitely one of the more embarrassing moments in American history. The Freedmen's Bureau. Freedmen's Bureau was an organization established in 1865 by an act of Congress. Started to wind down in 1869, but it lasted until 1870. It was led by General O.O. Howard, who is pictured here on the slide. Now, what was the responsibilities of the Freedmen's Bureau? I'm going to read a very quick one sentence from Eric Foner in his book on Reconstruction. Its responsibilities can only be described as daunting. They included introducing a workable system of free labor into the South, establishing schools for freedmen, providing aid to the destitute, aged, ill, and insane, adjudicating disputes amongst blacks and between the races, and attempting to secure for blacks and white unionists equal justice from the state and local governments established during presidential Reconstruction. So they had a lot that they were responsible for. And all of this was done while being massively underfunded. To put it in perspective, at its height, there was about 900 agents working for the Freedmen's Bureau in the entirety of the South. In 1866 alone, there were 12 agents in the entirety of the state of Mississippi. Still, they were actually able to accomplish quite a bit. Education was one of the most important things they accomplished. As you can see from the picture, there's a freedman's school here with a bunch of students standing out front. Education, out of all the things they did, was the one thing that they meant to be a permanent fixture, and it was. Once again, though, they were underfunded. So most of those schools were actually not paid for by the Freedmen's Bureau. They were actually paid for by Northerners, and the acts of establishing the schools and staffing the schools was facilitated by the Freedmen's Bureau. They also had a big hand in medicine. So for the African American community in the South, most of them had never had access to medical help. And there were many African Americans who had learned a lot about medicine, especially in birthing children. There were like many African American midwives that were probably extremely skilled at their craft. But in general medicine, and access to drugs and vaccines was not something that the African American community had really had access to, except through their enslavers during slavery, and that was only as a cost benefit analysis. So if your health was not worth it to your enslaver, you did not receive medical care. This was a huge change and a huge boon for the African American community, as most white doctors would have little reason to see African Americans since most of them wouldn't have the funds to pay. And once again, even in the North, you have a very racist group of people who aren't going to want to do these things. But the Freedmen's Bureau was able to find doctors who were willing to do this, and was able to facilitate them providing medical care for a much needed section of our society. They also provided a court system. This court system would have been in tandem with the state courts that had existed at the time. Those state courts would obviously be commonly skewed to favor whites, especially if we recall looking at some of those black codes a little bit earlier. The Freedmen's Bureau court system was meant to be much more fair, and plenty of African Americans went to the Freedmen's Bureau with complaints against other African Americans, but they also were able to go to the Freedmen's Bureau to deal with situations with whites. So if you're an African American and your family's being treated unfair, or you're being treated unfair, maybe you're not getting the pay that was agreed upon, you can then bring your employer to the Freedmen's Bureau court system and hopefully get a fair trial, and ideally get paid what you are being denied. Lots of freedmen also went to the Freedmen's Bureau in cases, as we had talked about, sharecropping. So if you agreed to a certain split of the crop and you believe you're getting cheated, you could get a fair trial in the Freedmen's Bureau courts. There was also a lot of court cases that involved assaults against African Americans, and the Freedmen's Bureau was able to adjudicate many of those, which I'm sure brought comfort to many violated African American. It's important to note that they were not a welfare system. O.O. Howard was very proud of this fact. He fought to not be a system of welfare. At the end of the Freedmen's Bureau's run, they had decided, their books had showed that most of the monies they had given out were as loans, not as grants. This may sound a bit weird to modern Americans looking at this piece of history. I mean, when we generally think of helping out other nations, or when there's a natural disaster, or just how we give aid to other countries, the first thing we usually do is send cash, right? Because that's what helps everything. At this point in time, the world generally did not work that way, especially the United States. Right now, when you think of voting for, say, a president, you think, what can the president do for me? What is my government going to do for me? You have a problem? You can call your local senator. Not sure they'll listen, but you can call them, and you can ask them to do A, B, or C for you. At this point in time, that was not how Americans viewed their government. It was generally looked at more the opposite or way around. What can I do to help my government, not what my government can do to help me. So this may sound weird now, but back then, the idea of not being a system of welfare, even though it's a group of society that I think most of us can admit today really needed a little bit extra help, the Freedmen's Bureau was there to help, but not in the ways that we would see it today. And also, Freedmen's Bureau was really, really, really hated by President Andrew Johnson. He tried many a time to dismantle the organization, and if you look at those dates again, they outlasted his presidency. The road to radical Reconstruction. So if you'll remember, in 1865, in April of 1865, the Civil War ended. 8 months later, in December, President Johnson goes before Congress and announces that the country had been reunified. Congress disagreed. It's important to understand what's going on in Congress right now. The southern states, as I've already kind of mentioned, were no longer a part of the United States. They had to petition to become states again and to have a say in the runnings of the country. So many southern states didn't have representatives in Congress. Those that did were sometimes Republicans, sometimes more Republican leaning. This is also a period where we're seeing African Americans starting to enter politics, although not quite in 1865, but as things progress, we will see a lot of them. But during this period of radical Reconstruction, Congress is really, really Republican. So it's a very liberal Congress. Yes, you heard me that right. Republican is liberal at this time. And they have this crazy, crazy idea. At least some of them do. There's this section of them that are labeled as radicals because they have the audacious belief that African Americans and whites are somehow equal. That may sound funny to Americans today, but back in the 1800s, this was not a thing. Literally months ago, these men and women were largely owned by other Americans. Now we have this group in Congress who's insisting that these people should be equal. It is important to remember most Americans are still extremely racist, even in the North. North is not this bastion of equality. Most Republicans in Congress still do not agree with this idea, but this small group of radical Republicans is very powerful, and they are the ones pulling a lot of the strings, and they're going to lead after presidential Reconstruction into radical Reconstruction, and part of that is because of President Johnson's declaration that the country had been reunified. We have here a list of important legislation that was passed in the early years of Reconstruction. As we've already discussed, in 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed, and it abolished slavery, except for the purposes of incarceration. And yes, it does say incarceration within that amendment. And what's the significance of this amendment, though? I mean, obviously, morally, it's a huge win for the United States. But other than that, and I think most historians would agree that without this amendment, the United States would have fallen into a second civil war. I think Lincoln would agree with that. When he first became president, he had no intentions of abolishing slavery. He, in fact, didn't believe that he could abolish slavery. But during the war, he came to realize that this was, in fact, the single issue that was dividing the country more than anything else. The South had an economic and a cultural system based on slavery. There was no way that this could stand, and America could stand as one unified whole. Even President Johnson came to realize this during this period. In 1866, we have the Civil Rights Bill. This was a bill that was meant to make African Americans equal in front of the law, so laws like the Black Codes could not be enforced. Congress passed this bill, but it was vetoed by President Johnson, who believed that it put too much power in the hands of the federal government, which also meant he believed that it took too much power away from the individual states. He also did not want to see African Americans as legally or socially or in any way equal to whites. This law was reintroduced, and it had so much support on the reintroduction that President Johnson couldn't veto it, and it became the law of the land. In 1867, the Reconstruction Act was voted, also vetoed by Johnson, but had a veto-proof majority in Congress. So this is another act where President Johnson is trying to stop Congress from taking actions, but Congress is uniting to overpower him. This specific Reconstruction Act split the South into 5 military districts. These military districts were run not by Confederates like Johnson had put into power, but by people who were more in line with the radical Reconstructions in Congress, Republicans in Congress. Those individuals allowed for state governments that not only included African Americans, but were able to allow African Americans to hold office and obviously to vote. This created this amazing moment in American history where we have the late 1860s, we have African Americans starting to enter politics, holding office, becoming active members of our republic. Unfortunately, after Reconstruction, this is something that would not be seen again until the 1960s. This is also the moment where radical Reconstruction begins. So those radical Republicans now have the power they need to go around Johnson, and they do. In 1868, we have the 14th Amendment, which is really the Civil Rights Bill, but stronger, and an amendment to the Constitution. So it's no longer just a bill, it is part of our Constitution. It made African Americans citizens, along with everyone else who was born on American soil. This is important even to this day when we have these conversations, that this is why this was created. This is why we have birthright citizenship. It was meant to stop any arguments that African Americans were not Americans. This was a real concern after the Civil War. No one knew what was going to happen, including with African Americans, on where they were going to be. There were ideas of self-deportation and forced deportation. There were movements during the antebellum period, which is before the war, of African Americans who were actively attempting to move back to Africa, which is where we get that racist terminology from, of sending African Americans back to Africa. This was an idea that many groups sought to enact. Even I've heard President Lincoln was not opposed to this idea. This specific amendment said, no, we're not going to get rid of these people. They are Americans in every way, shape, and form, and they are to this day, as is everyone who is born on American soil. So in conclusion, we have President Johnson being thrust into the role of president, even though it was something he never wanted. We have the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery and kept our country from a further division. The Freedmen's Bureau was created to help African Americans assimilate into their new position as citizens and active participants in the United States. We had the creation of black codes and the return to slavery era labor in the South, largely via sharecropping, although that came a little later, but the process was still there. It was an attempt by both actions were an attempt by the South to recreate the ideas of slavery. Unfortunately, the black codes were short-lived, although are still one of the more embarrassing points of American history. The sharecropping continued on considerably longer. Radical Republicans took power from President Johnson. They impeached President Johnson, which was the first time an American president was ever impeached. The South was split into 5 military districts with new governments, and as you can see on this slide, this shows where those military districts were. We also had the 14th Amendment, which made all people born on U.S. soil into American citizens. Thank you, and I hope you will enjoy the next portion in my Reconstruction lectures.